Okay, so this is the final part to Lecture 17. We've been talking about precarious manhood theory, in which men are pressured to man up by aggressing others, but also by taking a great deal of punishment themselves. Sociologists refer to that as the cult of self-cruelty. And I'm using boxing as an example here, in part because of some interesting work done by a sociologist whose name I won't try to butcher here, perhaps Waquant. Anyway, he interviewed boxers and produced a paper, the title of which is on this slide in case you want to look it up for yourself. And what he found is that boxers were ambivalent toward their sport, finding in it a passion or a calling, but also redemption, a springboard for discipline, self-confidence, and a shield against the harsh life of the streets, in the words of the sociologist. But boxers also, here's where the ambivalence comes in, admitted that as bodies trained, exhibited, and marketed for money, they are pawns in a game of ruthless exploitation, an objectified commodity which they expressed using three distinct idioms. The first is prostitution. They compared themselves to prostitutes and the manager or fight promoter to a pimp who uses them, selling them for a quick buck without regard for their well-being. As Randall Tex Cobb, a former heavyweight, put it, I'm a whore who sells his blood instead of his ass. I never made much money being good looking, but there's always somebody who'll pay me to take a punch. Another idiom was slavery, likening the ring or the gym to a plantation and the fighter to the slave who toils under the tutelage of his master/manager. As you can imagine, it's a language that has a particularly bitter resonance for African American fighters. Animal husbandry is a third idiom, which suggests that boxers are treated in the manner of dogs, pigs, stallions, and other commercially valued livestock. All three idioms, or metaphors if you prefer, denounce the immoral, indeed inhumane, merchandising of live bodies. But dehumanizing men is not unique to boxing. Many sports treat men's bodies as violence objects and thus as expendable. Moreover, just as women too frequently go along with being dehumanized as sex objects, men often accept tacitly being dehumanized as violence objects. We don't really even notice it, much less take the time to question it. It's simply the price they pay to be a man. In the documentary, The Film You Live In, the filmmakers put a lot of blame for this on sports. Likewise, a New York Times Magazine article from, I think, 2009 gave several examples. The article is titled, Athletes, a Hard-Hearted Fraternity. And it points out that thanks to a culture of invincibility and machismo, over the decades, many athletes have resisted new or improved safety equipment, such as the batting helmet Rawlings introduced, designed to withstand a 100-mile-per-hour fastball. So a player for the New York Mets said, I'm not wearing it. There's got to be a way to have a more protective helmet without all that padding. It's brutal. We're going to look like a bunch of clowns out there. Over the years, similar reactions, similar types of resistance have greeted safety improvements that eventually became accepted. So in the case of hockey, Gump Worsley, who played for New York, said, why, all of a sudden, after hockey has been played for 70 years, do they decide we should wear masks? After being hit in the face, Jacques Plante started to wear a mask in 1959, despite his teammates' angry protests. And today, every NHL goalie wears one. But when it was introduced, players resisted it. NASCAR is another example. Tony Stewart, who's a champion racer, said, if I'm not comfortable with it on, then I'm not comfortable in my car. And if I'm not comfortable in my car, I'm endangering myself and everyone on the track by wearing it. In 2001, NASCAR required drivers to wear head and neck restraints after the deaths of 4 drivers in just 17 months. Many other drivers, though, also opposed the mandate, but eventually they were forced to comply, and lives have been saved. What about cycling? Making helmets mandatory was a tough sell to professional cyclists. Riders went on strike in 1991 when the International Cycling Union tried to force the issue. But in 2003, a rider crashed and died from head injuries, and this time the union prevailed. But today, cyclists are still grumbling about it. And then football is the classic example. Howard Roberts, writing about the Bears and Bill Hewitt, said he never wore headgear for the simple reason that it bothered him and he felt it handicapped his play. Hewitt was one of the last players without a helmet when the NFL made them mandatory in 1943. Another holdout was Dick Plasman, also Bears end. Some teammates felt Plasman really didn't need a helmet. I mean, said one, he had a piece of cement for a head. That's an example of dehumanization, right? Someone with a piece of cement for a head isn't human, but an inanimate object, albeit a glorified one, because football players are idolized because of their speed and strength. But they also push their bodies to the limit, tackling and ramming each other violently with their helmets. Football players often suffer concussions and spinal injuries, and playing the game is said to age a person physically beyond their years. Back in 2010, Rutgers' own Eric LeGrand was paralyzed from a broken neck suffered during a brutal attack, a tackle on the field. But it turns out that cognitive damage is what players really need to fear most, given how common it is. What scientists have learned from studying the brain autopsies of dead football players is that multiple blows to the head lead to severe brain deterioration that mimics what happens to the brain as a result of dementia. Called CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, it shows up in the brains of even high school kids who played for less than 2 years, suggesting it does not take much punishment for long-term brain damage to occur. Whether 18 years old or 50, players' brains look like those of 70-year-olds with Alzheimer's. Just something you might want to consider if you have a son one day who is being recruited to play football. The conclusion the researchers came to, well, a lead scientist and a huge football fan had hopes of being able to recommend something, a new type of helmet, or at least a career span shortened in length that might be considered safe. But as a result of the studies, has since been forced to conclude that football is so cruel it should simply be banned, at least as it's played today. But the warrior mindset reflected by football and other sports is not likely to disappear anytime soon. I don't know if you have access to HBO, but in 2019, John Oliver did a deep dive into World Wrestling Entertainment, finding that wrestlers frequently died young. The mean age was 46. Why? Because they're treated like cattle, I mean freelance contractors, which meant that they were denied health care, yet unable to sign with anybody else in order to get benefits and better pay. Beyond sports, violent films and TV shows portray the majority of men's lives as expendable in order to exalt just one or a handful of heroes. For example, Bond films or anti-film heroes such as those portrayed in the television shows Breaking Bad and The Sopranos. But really, examples are endless. You should find no scarcity of examples to think about as you complete exercise 8. Common themes of masculine superpowers and murderous mayhem are so ubiquitous in our media, we don't even notice it until you start doing so. They actually reflect social Darwinism, this notion that only the most alpha males will survive the carnage, and that's okay. All other men are expendable, and that's entertainment. But there's a very big research gap that I'm coming back to now. there's lots of attention focused on women being portrayed as sexual objects and how media degrades their humanity and how that impacts women personally, psychologically. But there's very little work centered on how men are portrayed as violence objects whose lives are seemingly worth almost nothing. I mean, if you gave me a choice between being dehumanized as a sex object or a violence object, I know which one I would prefer. And that's why I assigned the gender and aggression exercise. Routinely slaughtering men for entertainment or watching them suffer for sport dehumanizes men. And when you dehumanize any group of people, it makes murder more palatable. This is not to say that violent media leads to violent behavior. The jury's still out, and there's compelling research for both sides. But there is an established consequence of exposure to violent media that we ought to take seriously. That is desensitization. If portraying men as violence objects dehumanizes men and decreases our sensitivity to male suffering even a little, then this is a serious negative consequence of popular entertainment. So exercise 8 is designed to sensitize you to a social reality that probably costs men more than we realize. So circling back to the mask you live in, you'll recall that it describes how men are taught to degrade other men as weak or gay to bolster their own masculinity, and also to put a shield around them so that other men won't then start taunting them, right? So it works as a defense mechanism in more than one way. But the need to treat others inhumanely, to feel better about oneself, stems from the precariousness of manhood. But it's also the case that men are given highly mixed messages about what manhood means, as Paul Kibble's Act Like a Man box shows. So in the documentary, you can see Act Like a Man box. Very briefly, it's on a whiteboard while one inmate is talking to other inmates about the violence that got them into prison. So here's a chance for you to pause the movie and take a closer look at what the Act Like a Man box contains. You can see things under the men are that are stereotypes we've talked about, men being more likely to be breadwinners than women, or violent, mean. Also, men charged to have control over women. But notice all the feelings: confused, angry, scared, ashamed. Makes me think of that wonderful high school teacher in the documentary, which portrays these kids writing out their feelings on a mask, on a piece of paper, and then they swapped the pieces of paper and talked about the feelings they can show to other people and the ones they have to hide. All these feelings of vulnerability are the ones they have to hide. And then what's at the top of the prescriptions for men? The very first one is have no emotions. And yet look at all the feelings that men have. And you wonder why we have trouble with what our popular culture likes to call toxic masculinity, but which I would prefer we start calling fragile masculinity. According to Paul Kibble, the reason we know men are placed in a box is because when a boy tries to step out of it, he's pushed back in with names like wimp, sissy, mama's boy, girl, fag, queer, nerd, punk, bitch, and others even more graphic. Behind those names is the threat of violence. Girls are placed in a very different box, so society doesn't accept beating women up the way we are brainwashed to accept beating up on men. But maybe this is changing. So for exercise 8, I think you might consider whether or not women should join in. By considering the increased portrayals of violent women in the media. Just in my lifetime, here are some prominent examples. I think it kind of started with Kill Bill, but there's many more examples now. If you think about them, you might decide if you think it's good or bad for gender equality for women to be portrayed as violent. Is this good for women because it gives them the opportunity to be seen as strong and to be viewed as men's equals? Or could it backfire by making it more acceptable to brutalize women just as we brutalize men in the media and think nothing of it? Or what about the stereotypical moral superiority of women, which can bring them benevolent sexism? Wouldn't women be at risk for losing benevolent sexism, which, after all, does temper hostile sexism? And is it good for women to shed benevolent sexism or paternalism when there's no guarantee that what they would be facing is 100% pure hostile sexism as a result of that loss? In addition, violence reflects a lack of empathy for one's victims. It necessitates having a heartless, take no prisoners mentality. If women started to follow men's lead in this regard, who will be left to care for others? Wouldn't humanity be better off if men could express their empathy instead of women becoming more brutal? I mean, there's more than one way to spread gender equality. For exercise 8, these are some of the issues you might think about, but it's up to you. I really want you to focus on how brutally men are treated by our culture, how little attention their dehumanization receives, both in popular culture as well as in the research literature, and then how that gap, that absence of thinking about this issue costs both men and women alike. So I hope these are helpful for you to think about before you complete exercise 8, and that this, I thank you for your attention for lecture 17.